Thank you so much for your time, especially during your reading week. You're sharing your knowledge and wisdom, and as you know, I have you as in all of the series of the people that I'm interviewing, have you as an influencer because of what you've done in this space for the last 40 years. And I was talking to a young eco entrepreneur last night, and I was telling him that I was having a conversation with you today, and he didn't know who you were. So I told him he has to watch, and for him, I will give you a very brief introduction of who you are. 40 years of experience in sustainability, 70 boards, 20 books, 50 papers, 3 professorships, and and coined triple bottom line, which is just incredible. Hence, why you are part of the influencer team and trio of interviews. I have to say, your Green Swans book is life-changing and should be mandatory reading for everybody. But note to self: don't listen to it while riding a scooter through London, because there were a few moments where I nearly died. I was like, "Oh my God, what did he say?" I had to pull over and play it back and listen to it again. So I've actually listened to it twice, which was hugely inspirational and an absolute a fantastic read. So I've got lots of questions, I know, and some of them are we probably won't get through them. But the first one, I'm in total awe of how long you've been doing this, and in what seems a relatively brief time for me, having started, pivoted my career in 2007. It's been hard going, and you've been doing it for much longer. What's kind of kept you going, and what have been the challenges and the inspirations to keep you going?
Well, many things have kept me going. Can I just check that you can hear me?
I can, yeah, no, perfectly.
Good. One is I've not had anywhere else to go. I sort of came into this space when I was 11 in 1961. Professionally, I came into it right at the beginning of the 1970s. And there's always been enough progress to keep me going. Plus, I've largely worked with organizations I've helped to sort of co-found. And that actually gives a reasonable amount of space and flexibility for somebody like me. Whereas I hugely admire those people who have actually gone into, for example, major corporations or government departments or finance houses or whatever, and fought the battle internally. We've always had the ability to resign a contract or a relationship if we felt it wasn't going in the right direction, where that can be a bit more existential if this is your sole means of livelihood and you're working for a very large company. Another thing that's been really important has been I didn't focus on any one area. I mean, the environment is why I came into this, nature, wildlife, the sort of Gaia agenda in a way. But I've also been interested in the social, the political, the ethical, the economic dimensions of all of this. And so if ever, one of the things I've always said is that one of my life skills, if it is that, is a propensity to get bored before other people do. Doesn't mean that I show it particularly, but when I know what I'm doing or what I'm meant to be doing, something in my brain starts to turn off, and I want to go somewhere I don't know what I'm meant to be doing, don't know how to do it. And that's actually quite a challenge for organizations that I've worked with. But so there's always been enough to keep me interested. And then final point is, I met my wife in 1968, so we've been together for quite a long time, over half a century. And she is, one of the reasons why I'm sort of still semi-sane. So I think family is an enormously important element of all of this.
I mean, the entrepreneurial piece, I think, is really, really important, and it does give you a purpose. It gives you a reason to kind of get out of bed, because you're paying salaries, and you've kind of put your flag on a mast, and you want to do that. So I think that certainly not necessarily a calling, but I think it is a calling. I don't think many people can be entrepreneurs, because it's super hard. and working in big businesses is tough. I think a word you use a lot is exponential scaling, and I totally agree. And the whole point of this podcast series or this interview series is one of the frustrations I had from my previous life, where everybody is connected in these old legacy industries, and in sustainability and environmental challenges, very few people are connected. And collaboration is one piece, but then we need more levers. What are the levers that you see that you think we need, and who can we talk to help make that happen faster?
Well, in terms of inspiring change, whether that's at the individual human level or whether that's organizational or even societal, civilizational levels of change, there are many different levers, and a number of people have explored those. For me, a lot of the early communication with individuals and organizations and so on was built around an early perception that things were going wrong, and that some of those things had exponential trajectories to them. So Danella Meadows, who sort of did one of the 4 authors of the Limits to Growth study, she did excellent work. And if people haven't come across her work on how to leverage change or leverage change, I recommend it very highly. In a sense, I've often described what we've done as a bit akin to surfing, in the sense that there are these big societal pressure waves that come along. And if you can detect before most people where those waves are headed and what they will, in a sense, force people to do over time, you can sort of almost arbitrage. You can get ahead, and you can play back into boardrooms and C-suites and so on, what you see and what most people do not yet see. I think clearly a lot of the early messaging around environment in particular was built around fright, fear. I mean, it was built around scenarios and forecasts that looked on the face of it pretty horrible. I think most of those were dismissed at the time, and yet here we are with actually some of the outside trajectories that were forecast decades ago playing out, and whether it's droughts or fires or floods or whatever it is, we're in that future, and it seems to be, back to your exponential point, it seems that all of these things are now on exponential upwards trajectories, and that's a problem, just finally, because our global governance, our political systems, the brains of our political leaders are not wired to cope with those sorts of trajectories, things that start quite some way outside the area that you're focusing on, and then sort of seem to almost go in other directions, or sort of you lose track of them, and then suddenly there's an inflection point, and they're in your space, and then you're in your face, and what the hell do you do about that? And I think we've seen CEOs and business leaders struggle with it. We've seen financiers and investors struggle with that. It's only now that people like Angela Merkel and so on are face to face with the really brutal reality that is coming at us. But I don't think scare tactics are the best way, even now, even when we can see the reality. They're not always the best way to engage hearts and minds. I think that is around opportunity, and it is around messages of hope. But I think you've got to blend it. You've got to have the heaven and hell visions at the same time.
I mean, that's one of the. I mean, it's with your experience. I mean, global governance and scale and trajectory. I mean, governments don't move very quickly, and it feels like nature is moving faster, or is now moving much faster than they could ever have imagined. And we talk about the climate decade. There's a huge amount of stuff we need to do in the next 10 years, and I think there's lots of will, but how do we put frameworks around that so that businesses the businesses that are trying to do good, like B Corps, can move faster.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, one of my favorite subjects was always history, but also counterfactuals and science fiction. So the mixture of the past, the present, and the alternative presents and alternative futures. And when I looked at governance and politics through the lens of history when I was at school, one of the things that was very clear very quickly was that as a species, we're singularly poor at setting up effective political and government and governance mechanisms. We tend to do it when we've had the fear of God put us in us. So, for example, the First World War gave us the League of Nations, which is a shambles in many ways, didn't stop the Second World War. And the Second World War, when we had just been seared beyond comprehension, in 1944, you had Bretton Woods, and we, I say we, the world, or key players in the world, put together elements of a structure that for a very long time served us incredibly well, but now it doesn't. And you know, I have the greatest respect for people who work within the UN system or these different international global systems, but they're not fit for purpose, the systems, not the people. In terms of what's now coming, I have relatively low expectations, for example, of a G7 meeting, a G20 meeting, a COP26 meeting, all of which happen this year, obviously. I live in hope that new leadership will emerge. And just to conclude that sort of arc in a way, what's happening, I think, is that the only actors with the freedom of maneuver to think about and address some of these really big systemic changes are obviously civil society organizations. They've been telling us about it for a very long time, and business, and to some very much more limited degree, the financial markets, investors and financial analysts and so on. And so what we're seeing is business leaders being called upon to act almost as de facto global governance actors. And I think that's necessary because we don't have an alternative at the moment. But it's a really singularly bad way of dealing with these issues longer term, because these people are not democratically elected. They're not accountable in a way that politicians ought to be, even if they're not always. So I think we're at a very interesting transitional point, and we have increasingly, both in the book, I talk about the U-bend, a period in our collective history where an era, an order, which you've all grown up with. I was born in 1949. So I've totally grown up in that era, is now starting to crumble all around us. And that process will accelerate over
time. My view on government is that they kind of, business leads and society leads and governments kind of governs. And they are the, historically should be the supporters of the system.
But Mark, very quickly, that historically that wasn't true. And if you take an issue like environment, government-led, business fought tooth and nail to have the changes and regulations and so on. And you still continue to see that in threatened industries. And then over time, when we got to the beyond compliance agenda, then business started to step up, become a bit more competitive. But I think one of the things that business leaders are now realizing is that they can't do this on their own. Even with the best will, if they make all of these wonderful net zero or whatever commitments, this needs government behind it. It needs sustained, effective, efficient government action. And at the moment, that's in fairly short order.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's so many things that we get to collaborate. You need a level playing field, or you need confirmation that we're moving in the right direction and that things aren't going to be taken away. Because one of the challenges and one of the questions is, an old friend of mine, financial colleague, said there's one thing that can fix all problems, and that's money. Yeah. And the problem with disruption is that disruption usually happens in small pockets, in places that money doesn't get to, or they can't get to the money. Yeah. And I think there's this disconnect between SMEs who are happy to really try hard and break stuff and get hurt before they can scale, but they can't really get there because they're held back because the trillions of dollars that everybody says is now available for ESG investing, they don't go anywhere near SMEs. So how do we bridge that?
Well, I think one of the things that I mentioned a moment ago that many of our moments where we woke up to the need to govern ourselves at a greater, bigger scale than we had done traditionally came after wars or depressions or whatever. I think what we're seeing at the moment is a growing recognition that something very different is going to be needed, and yet nobody who is in positions of power at the moment can see how we get from where we are now to where we would need to be. And therefore, I think you need some sort of convulsive moment where people are forced to recognize that need. They're forced together to collaborate in ways that they wouldn't have previously even thought was possible. And I don't know where we are in that sequence. I think the tempo of bad news is accelerating the whole time. I think the good news around whatever it might be, Tesla sales or battery market trajectories or the falling price of renewable energy, that's the opportunity side that's now coming through. And the very, very great interest that younger people now have in trying to fix some of this stuff, because it's more their future than it is the future of people like me, who are baby boomers, and in many ways have screwed all of this up. So but I don't think, in a way, that we will see the UN reproduced. I don't think we'll see many of the traditional forms of governing the world reproduced. I think, exactly as you say, there are different ways of networking, of prioritizing, of assembling around new priorities. And around some of that stuff, innovation in the political and governance space, I think some of the change will start to nucleate and then, to some degree, scale. I think the one thing that worries me at the moment is the very big companies are proving very deft in buying up those sort of disruptive businesses. So we're on Instagram. Who owns Instagram now? That is all part of scaling. But I think there's a set of values incorporated in the giant companies which aren't always, despite what they say and the commitments they make, aren't always what we I think need.
Well, yeah, they certainly aren't. I had a fascinating conversation with a lady yesterday, Claire Munn, who's a founder of Box Media, and she said, and I said, your friends, do you think that people have got this, and are they moving forward? And she said, well, there's a litmus test. I go straight into their kitchen and look into the sink, and if they're using bleach, then they don't. So that's her way of checking. And I think the big corporates are, they say they've got a great chat, but are they really doing what they need to do? I think what's concerning in what you're saying is that governments will need to change. They're not going to be the leaders, but business can't really establish a pathway without having some kind of confirmation. And while we're talking, I'm just trying to think. B Corp, and I absolutely love the B Corp movement, and we're a super proud B Corp, and we're one of the early adopters way back when. But they aren't a regulatory body either. They're a collective of people who are moving in the right direction. But even when I sit down and talk to B Corps with similar issues, they go, but we need some kind of formal confirmation that this is the path we're going on. So how do we get that?
Well, let me just do a mea culpa. Despite doing a book called The Green Consumer Guide in 1988, which sold something like 1 million copies in its various editions, you will still find bleach in our household. So if your friend comes into our kitchen or whatever, there will be bleach there. It serves a purpose, but we use it sparingly. How do we deal with this? I think part of I said earlier on, I've ridden waves, and we've seen since 1960, there have been 5 very big societal pressure waves that have impacted first on government, and then increasingly on business, and now increasingly on the financial markets. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to understand the dynamics of those waves. There's nothing automatic about them. They can be stopped, they can be accentuated or whatever, and then ride the energy in those waves. So I think the next 3 to 5 years we'll see the financial market may already feel that it's under a lot of scrutiny and pressure, but it isn't. And this whole sort of feeding frenzy around ESG, I think, is an industry that suddenly finds itself under pressure, and a bit like a chameleon is trying to throw up all the colors of the rainbow to protect its flanks and its interests and so on. I think ESG is a stepping stone, and I think we need to make sure that those people who adopt that agenda and create funds or whatever it is understand that it is a stepping stone. And the second point that I would make is that in 2018, so you mentioned the B Corporation movement. I too love it. 2 companies that I co-founded, Volans and then Sustainability, although I founded them in the reverse order, were respectively the first and second B Corps in the UK, and we incubated B Labs UK for 9 months in our offices. So I love all of that stuff. But I think we're now having to work, and B Lab are actually looking at this. We're going to have to open the spotlight out from individual wonderful companies doing individual wonderful things and cascading some of that through their supply chain and so on, to market dynamics and how we shift market dynamics over time. And that goes to pricing of things like greenhouse gas emissions and use of resources and so on. It also fundamentally goes to economics. And one area that I take a certain amount of comfort from is the fact that you now have people like Ray Worth and Mariana Mazzucato and so on, who are full-blown economists, but starting to think in a new way. And I think people often talk about paradigm shifts, and by that they mean all sorts of stuff. For me, a paradigm shift is something that takes 70 to 80 years to effect, partly because you have to get rid of one generation infected with the previous paradigm, and then the people they taught. And I think we're 60 some years into a paradigm shift that started with people like Rachel Carson and Jim Lovelock. And I think this next 10 to 15 years are going to see a screaming set of exponentials around that, where this new paradigm comes crashing in all around us. And a lot of people, including a lot of people of my age, are going to be profoundly upset by that, because it's going to upset all sorts of apple carts, their pensions, their beliefs and what are important. They're going to be kind of intergenerational tensions. So I think it's an immensely exciting period, but an immensely challenging one. And anyone who argues that history is dead has got another thing coming, I imagine.
I mean, I think the next 15, totally agree with you. I think the next 15 years are going to be so not catastrophic. There will be catastrophic changes across the board, and we're seeing them literally every day.
Well, Mark, if I may, just for anyone who's listening to this or seeing it in some form, if they haven't come across the work of Rethink X, based both in the UK and Silicon Valley, I recommend it beyond measure, because they've done a series of studies of how technology and novel business model driven disruption is going to hit one industry after another: transportation, mobility, cattle ranching and dairying, energy, finance, and so on. The most recent one is on climate change. And those studies, to my mind, capture the full scale of the positive disruption that is coming our way. So I don't want to sound like an Old Testament prophet, sort of sackcloth and ashes. This is going to change. It's going to, and some people will benefit, but quite a lot of people won't, and they'll fight.
Perfect. Well, on that, so Rethink X. What other, obviously other than Green Swans and some of your other work, what else do you think people should be focusing on or reading that will help them move their minds, move their bodies, move their wallets?
Well, it's a great question, Mark. And I think, you might expect me as a writer to say, go read books. And there are masses of books out there now on these sorts of subjects. But one of the things I consistently say is that after all of these lockdowns, many of us have got out of the habit of being out in the wider world. We got out of the habit of engaging people who are, in a sense, not like us. And I think one of the most powerful learning experiences that people, particularly in business and government too, can have is where they go out and they meet. I mean, the old order was that you would have stakeholder capitalism. You know, the Business Roundtable has finally again woken up to that. But the idea there was you brought selected people from the outside world who could represent an emerging reality, and you did the whole thing on your own terms, in your own space, and so on. I think people have got to get out, and they've got to go and meet people who are creating the future in their own spaces and on their own terms. And I was once doing one of these things many years ago, and we went to Silicon Valley, and there was a company, startup company, originally came out of Israel, called Project Better Place, then Better Place. And I just remember the reaction of some of the people who came and saw some of the autonomous vehicle type longer term thinking. And Uber was another one where Travis Kalanick received the chairman of a very, very big German automotive company by saying, when this guy arrived with a group of people, don't know why you're here. In 10 years, we will have run you and your business off the road. And you know, this German chairman, who was in effect like the foreign minister of Germany, went off to the restroom and was overheard to say, excuse the language, but fuck, I've been briefed on this, I've read about this, and I know about this stuff. This is the first time I've viscerally experienced this alternative future. And he found it shocking. And that future is, for many of us, going to be shocking, not necessarily always in a bad way, in good ways as well. But I think we've all got to get out. And part of that may be just going to see some of the authors of the books that have influenced our thinking. But we're at one of those moments where connections, and particularly unusual connections, are going to be really, really important. So I think conversation sits and stretch conversation sit right at the heart of change now.
That's amazing. Get out, connect laterally, and stretch conversations.
Yeah, and that's not always comfortable. We all know it. I mean, we'd prefer to talk to people over a pint or whatever it might be, who we're sort of cozy with. But what we've now got to do, I mean, you think of Black Lives Matter, you think about all of these different movements that are starting to sort of coalesce in the same way that civil rights did in the 50s, 60s, and so on. We've got to go out and talk to those people, if we're not already doing so, and understand what drives them, and also what will take their interests as their movements evolve over time, because they won't always be pushing those particular views and or priorities. And one of the things I did, sort of, for example, a few years back, was when Extinction Rebellion came along, I went out and talked in the street to some of the protesters of all ages. I had one of the founders come in and about a few weeks before the protest started in London, because I wanted to know who they were and what they were doing. And then I sort of coordinated a old order story, but coordinated a letter to the Times with 20 CEOs. I mean, most obviously former Unilever CEO Paul Pullman, but with others as well, just to say, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because these people look different, don't assume that they're not you in a different age or in different clothes. And so on. I still absolutely believe it. I think that the people who will be the champions of and the sort of torchbearers of these new agendas won't always look comfortable, but we've got to talk to them, and they've got to talk to us, hopefully.
I had a very similar experience where I was asked to give a presentation to senior buyers of a very big supermarket chain on the day that Extinction Rebellion were supergluing themselves to various buildings, and the question was, do you think these guys are serious? I was like, what? That's pretty serious. Yes, if you want them to be your customers, or if you want customers that are, this is where the direction of travel is clear. these are the leading indicators. You need to be thinking about it, and they just wasn't a thing for them.
Well, it's interesting. I was reading earlier today about somebody trying to stop in the 60s, local people in St. Ives in Cornwall throwing bricks and so on at the hippies who were coming in. And, you know, the hippies have to some degree gone. I mean, I sort of was one of them myself, but the values that they stood for, the priorities that they embraced, or at least some of them, have become mainstream. And so sustainability, you know, which when I first founded the company called Sustainability with a couple of other colleagues back in 1987, I mean, nobody had heard that term. Nobody knew what it meant. We were spelling it the whole time for years. And now, you know, any company without a sustainability strategy, what planet are they on? And yet what happens then is people dilute the understanding and the definitions of what sustainability might involve to suit their particular, rather more immediate priorities, which is why I think we have to keep jumping the agenda forward. And I think Extinction Rebellion is one of the organizations, networks that has actually quite successfully done that.
You know, I totally agree. And again, it's kind of, how do we empower those people, and how do we, you know, connect the old world and new world? And in my, you know, old world, they would never have a conversation with any of those people, and still probably wouldn't. And that's where I think, hopefully, you know, certainly the work that you've done and all the conversations that you've had, you bring it to life with the boards that you represent, and go, you know, we need to have, you know, we need to collaborate with these people with, you know, with everybody.
Well, just very quickly, Mark, it's been fascinating to me, because I have been in the space for decades, to see the old world transitioning. So, for example, you would have campaigners like Chris Rose of Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace and so on, and WWF, very rare record of working for some of the really big green NGOs, going from that to working in business. I mean, different people, different speeds. Some of them went through the becoming sort of financial analysts for green funds or whatever. Then some of those went into bigger companies. And at that time, that was very strange. But now it happens on a much accelerated timescale. And if I talk to HR people in major companies, they're just continuously saying, I was talking to a very senior investor on the continent of Europe earlier on today, and he's just saying everyone who comes through the door now has this new mindset that these are their issues. That, you know, they want to know what you're, as a company, as their potential future employer, doing. And if you're not doing enough, they probably won't come, or they won't stay very long.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say the shift for us, I mean, we make cleaning products, not very sexy. Manufacturing in Britain and making cleaning products, not very sexy. And for a decade, trying to get bright young things to come into manufacturing and slightly boring subject has been hard. Yeah. Now there's a queue saying we want to work for a business that has good values. We don't really care what you do, as long as you've got values, and, you know, we've got a skill set where we can help. So the certainly that paradigm, you know, has shifted, and, you know, hopefully B Corps and other companies that care will benefit from that. John, thank you so much for your time, and apologies for using Instagram, which is not the easiest, but pretty
Don't apologize, Mark, and it will become easier over time. Technology will evolve, and we will evolve. Certainly I will evolve, hopefully, to use these things more effectively. But thank you for the interest. Thank you for what you do. And actually, I think the product sector in which you operate is enormously important because it engages people in their everyday lives. And therefore, keep on trucking, if you would. And I look forward to keeping post or tabs on what you do.
Thank you very much, John. Hope to see you soon. Bye.
Me too.